Hey everyone, welcome to another live stream from Savvy, where Maggie Campbell is going to talk to us today all about still design. Very exciting. My name's Will Hookinga from American Rum Report. As I said, I'm here with Maggie Campbell. Maggie, how are you today? Are you excited to really dive deep on stills with everyone today?
I am. I'm nervous as always, but very excited.
It's good. It's good to get the feelings out in the open. So we're all, we're all on the same page and everything. It's going to be great. Yeah, we already have people: Toronto, Jamaica, San Francisco, Oahu, New York, Oakland. Oh, that's awesome.
Nick Pampa
Okay.
Nicolau. Hey, I
Yeah.
see him on there.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we're gonna get started in just a minute. First, real quickly, for anyone who's new to these live streams, just want to give you the lay of the land real quickly. So obviously, to your right, you likely see the chat window. Feel free to comment throughout the presentation over there. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We are going to try to save some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question that comes up at any point in the presentation, rather than entering that in the chat, you'll see a little button at the bottom that says "Ask a Question." Hit us with your question there, and that's the best way to make sure we see it and have it in one place. Also, if you want to invite friends to join us, that would be awesome. There's a share button at the top. So we already have 98, so close to 100. Help us break 100. Share with your friends and invite them. All right, with all that said, Maggie, to give everyone a quick introduction, Maggie is the President and Head Distiller at Privateer Rum in Ipswich, Massachusetts, Vice President of the American Craft Spirits Association, and experience with obviously rum, brandy, whiskey. You've worked with all different kinds of stills, seen many more in your travels. Why are we talking about still design today? What do you think is interesting, and what do you hope people get from being here with us?
Yeah, well, I love that this started out of sort of an interactive online session that you and I were in,
Yeah,
where we just kind of, you get like I always say, I never really want to present anything you can Google, right? So if you can
yeah,
Google a still schematic and see it, I don't
uh-huh.
really need to put that in a PowerPoint for you. Or if you can just Google it, whatever. But there's so much more to it than what is there. And as someone who studied still schematics at school and then went on to distill, I realized how different it actually really is in practice. And
Right,
so we were having this online interactive session where I was saying, well, that's true, but also, well, that's
right,
true, but also. And I think it just kind of revealed some layers and we couldn't get really deep there. So I'm really glad you invited me on here to kind of
yeah,
flesh some of that out and just talk about it's never just pot or column, right? And I
right.
always hear that.
Well, no, and I think like until recently, that's kind of how I thought about it. And yeah, I was listening to you talk about stills. I think it was on Instagram Live, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is answering so many questions for me, or like bringing up stuff that I didn't realize I didn't know. And then you did a couple of really great podcast episodes on the subject as well. So also, if you're here and you haven't listened to the Privateer podcast yet, I'd highly recommend it. It's really cool topics like still design, but also you've done great interviews. You did one with Richard Steele that was great. I think you can get Richard to open up a little, like other people can't, because y'all know each other. So that one was really great. Yeah. Anyway, everyone check out the Privateer Rum podcast. Look it up on Spotify, and you'll find it. But all that said, I'll turn things over to you now. I'm really excited to jump in and learn with everyone else who's here today.
Yeah, and I will give you carte blanche to zoom in on any of these slides that you
Okay.
think or slide them around as you think.
And I'll probably minimize my video just to give more real estate to you and the slides as well, so
And
people
feel
can
free
get
to
a.
minimize me too if that is
I never want to
you
minimize
figure it out.
you.
You have my permission.
Okay,
It's believe me, it's fine.
I have creative control.
You have total creative control to go buck wild. So yeah. So right there, you guys will see handles if you need them. I share a lot very openly on Instagram. I'm very available to answer questions. So yeah, we're a very accessible distillery,
Yeah,
and that's
I
a
just
lot of
threw a
how I
little
learned.
link. I just threw a little link to follow Maggie, by the way. So click
Oh,
that and
great.
do that if you haven't yet.
Thanks. I love that. I can't see you on the screen now, so it's like the voice of God coming in. Kind of
Yeah,
cool.
no, sorry, it's a little awkward.
I love it. I love it. That's very cool. So yes, that is me on my little ladder in front of our spirit still. So if you'll pop forward one more slide, we'll show an illustration that is going to be on the Habitation bottling, but there is like a much more simplified, easier to see, not me standing in the way, ideal picture of our still. And I feel like that is it was amazing when I finally received this. Like it really just capture exactly what's going on with our still here. So just a little background, we have a hybrid still, so you can see the pot on the left and the column on the right. We can distill up through the column if we want, or we can just distill straight out of the pot and bypass the column and not go through it at all. So that is what I'm distilling on now. But as we go through this seminar, we'll go over a number of different stills I've worked on and worked with. And I feel really fortunate to have that experience so that we can kind of get into it now. I know that Lee, who's on here, another distiller, explicitly asked for us to do Charente, which if anyone's ever had the Coeur de Chouf from St. James, their rum, they distill it like very, very small batches, like once a year on their Alembic Charente still. So it does have relevance to rum. So we're going to cover it too. So
Awesome.
If you'll go to the next one.
Yes.
And like Will said, we're going to try to leave plenty of time for questions. So feel free to put all your questions down there. So I always say you can tell the flavor of a spirit by the shape of the still. And, you know, as I mentioned when I was setting up this talk that we're going to do today, I kind of asked myself, you know, if you can Google it, I don't want to cover it. If it's easily accessible, I don't want to cover it. So if I'm going too fast, let us know. And if I'm going too basic, let me know. Give me plenty of feedback in the comments here. But essentially, I'm going to try to recreate for you guys today what the experience would be like if someone who is very serious about becoming a distiller or works at a distillery, when they come and visit Privateer for a shadow day, like a work with day, when we start the day, we kind of give a philosophy talk about our equipment and why we have what we have and how it all works. And so we're going to kind of try to do that for you today. And I even love that Robin on Facebook mentioned he's a bartender from Toronto. When he came to visit with Zan from Worthy Park, I had this whiteboard I brought around and I did all these drawings for them about the schematics inside. And he said, like, that really helped. And that's exactly what I'm trying to capture with some of the illustrations we'll see later. So
the illustrations are great, and you like we were going back and forth on email, and you were totally trying to downplay them, and like I was like these are great. I could never draw anything like this, so they're really fun and informative, and we'll get to those in a little bit.
I feel like it's very Kurt Vonnegut doodle.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone who's read a Kurt Vonnegut novel loves the pictures are some of the most fun parts, and that's what they are to this presentation.
Okay, good. Well, thanks. Thanks for having faith in me. So these are basically exactly what I would draw for a distiller or someone from rum who really knows their shit would be visiting our distillery. So one of the things I always say at the start of those talks is, you know, you could tell the flavor of a spirit by the shape of the still. For me as a distiller, and for other distillers I know, we walk into a distillery and we look at the equipment, and one of the first things we noticed is sizing. So is everything sized appropriately? Meaning, like, do they actually have enough fermenters to feed their still? How big is their still and how much spirit are they selling? You know, we start immediately looking like, does everything link up sizing wise? And, you know, we also can look at a still, and there's really key indicators when we look at a still that tell us exactly what the spirit is going to taste like. Or if I talk to a distiller, you know, across the world in an email and they describe their still, I can get an impression of how it tastes. And so that's kind of what we're going to try to do today, is like talk about, like, you know, when someone asks me, is it pot or column? That's such a simple question, and it doesn't capture much about how the spirit's going to taste. So hopefully today we'll cover that. So shape of the still, pot or column, right? So a pot still, even like a big, fat, round, squat pot still will make a totally different flavor than a very elongated, elegant, not like long sort of helmet. So the top of the still, if it's really long and really narrow, will make a totally different spirit. And with a column still, is it a single column batch distillate, which is going to be a lot of your bourbons and stuff, is going to be very different than, a double column, which oftentimes functions as the first column is a first distillation and the second column is a second distillation. But even those can produce very different spirits between them. And then the multi-column, which shows up in the rum world sort of during a lot of the era of sort of when this industrial ethanol, really, really high proof, almost vodka-like spirit trends are coming through. And stills are very expensive. You buy them, you plan to use them for a long time. And if you want to change your style by replacing a still, that is something that is a really big and serious decision. So when a lot of the multi-columns came through into the rum world to create this very, very high proof, very neutral style rum, you can see that that's not something that's just instantly going to be replaced just because trends become for richer styles. So they can linger a long time through a lot of places. And then retorts, doublers, thumpers, those are all essentially the same piece of equipment. Retorts we all know from rum. Doublers is often what it's called more internationally. And then thumpers is what you'll hear a lot in the US. And I got asked before this if retorts are always used on a pot and thumpers are always used on a column. And no, in the US, thumpers will be used on a pot still, they'll be used on a column still, they'll be used on everything. The word retort is not really one used sort of in the continental North America jargon, but it does sort of equate to retorts, or more internationally, if you say doublers, pretty much everyone knows what you mean. If you're working with distillers, usually all of them know what retorts mean too. I will say, of course, Americans like our proof system and our gallon system. We're the odd man out by using the word thumpers. But those are some basic concepts I think we all have here already. And we'll talk more in depth about how they all work. Don't worry, I don't assume you know exactly how everything works in these. But those are some simple categories of stills as far as like us understanding things simply. So considerations and key points. Are all pots open? This was something like my very limited North Continental American, much more, most of my professors were European. Scotch was a lot of what I learned originally. When I learned about pot stills, they were always open inside, meaning there's no plates or contact surfaces. You might see what's called packing, which if you imagine like a scouring pad of like spun steel, you might see to like scrub a dish. Imagine that being made out of copper and being shoved inside a still so that it creates a surface for liquid to gather on and for vapor to pass over the copper. You might see packing in a pot, but really pot stills were going to be totally open inside. And so for me, when I started learning so much more about the foundational experience of rum being in the Caribbean and how plates can be within pots, or within, all these different aspects, or after retorts, that's really when I got the picture. Like, it's not as simple as we think. The pot or column thing is really, it's problematic because it's not capturing at all kind of what's happening there. And so, yeah, the first time I saw plates inside the helmet of a pot still was actually here in America on a still that had thumpers, but we'll talk about that in a little bit before I start using a bunch of words we're not totally comfortable with. But are all pots open inside? I would say no. Something can be pot distilled out of a pot and still not necessarily be totally devoid of contact surfaces, plates, things inside. I think the understanding is many, many pots still have those in there within Caribbean rum culture, which is the foundational rum culture. So, if that is how they identify, they are correct. So it's not really my job to come in from a Scottish mindset and say, wait a second, there's plates in it. Is it really a pot anymore? That's really understood to be a part of the experience. So are all housings for contact plates columns? The reason you see that column structure is that it's holding those plates that we're we'll talk a lot more in depth about what are these plates and what do they do. So if those plates happen to be in the top of a helmet of a pot still, Is it no longer a column? Is it different? Is it fundamentally different? This is again where the pot column divide gets a little like silly and uninformative. We don't totally understand all that's going on. Is there an agitator? So an agitator means that within the still, there's a large paddle that stirs the wash or the low wines as it's being distilled. This is a really big choice for distillers to make. I think when no one has ever asked me, other than a professional distiller, is there an agitator in your still? And it's one of the first things I look for when I enter a distillery and I'm looking at a still. Obviously, this is not applicable to multi-columns or double columns. This is something you would see on a single column, a pot still, or a pot still hybrid with plates, because it would hold with this place where the liquid would begin to get warmed and go through this batch distillation. So the idea of an agitator is that it's mixing this wash as it's being distilled. So all of the dead yeast that might be in there, depending on how much yeast a distiller decides to include in the distillation. I like a lot of yeast for flavor. Is it suspended? Is it being constantly mixed with everything that's being distilled? And this has a couple effects. So if yeast sits on the bottom of the still, so when I worked at Germain Robin, we loved a lot of yeast in the still, but we had no agitator. So the yeast would sit on the bottom of the still and it would burn because it was all fire run, right? So it would burn and burn and burn. And this created a certain flavor, which could be really delicious, but if you went overboard, could become really acrid. It was all about getting that toast on that. And it also meant the lees were not in suspension. So these lees, these dead yeast that come over, they naturally bond oxygen. So they're natural antioxidants. So if they're in suspension while you're simmering this wash for 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, they can help bond oxygen and keep the wash from oxidizing and creating certain oxidized flavors throughout distillation. So if you were doing something that you wanted that fresh, bright primary source ingredient flavor, stirring the lees can really, really help retain that freshness. But if you don't have an agitator and the lees are all on the bottom, they're not going to have that same impact as if they were in suspension, and you're going to get more developed, less primary, more evolved flavors. So it's not going to be that cane flavor. It's going to be much more kind of this almondy, toasty quality. And just having that agitator inside the still makes that difference. So if you are looking for an agitator on a still, usually it looks like a little like cylindrical motor like sticking out of the still, and inside the still there'll be like a long wand and a paddle. And that's really a good indicator about whether or not they have an agitator. I will say that cleaning a still that uses an agitator is much more pleasant than when I had to crawl in and hand scrub the inside of a copper still that had, a month's worth of burnt yeast in it. So, yeah. So I've thrown some words around, right? Like contact plate. What's a contact plate? So when we're used to looking at a column still, or if you're asking if there's a column still, a column is a housing for plates, which we'll look at shortly. A contact plate is a surface within the still where descending reflux comes into contact with rising alcohol vapor. As this falling reflux comes into contact with vapor and the vapor pushes up and through this reflux, you are getting a really specific type of flavor creation. And it's different from, but not dissimilar to, what's happening in retorts and doublers. And I'll explain why. Basically, what is reflux, right? So I just said that this reflux is falling down in the still as alcohol vapor is coming up. Reflux is alcohol vapor that has come up inside a still, and the molecule is so large, it doesn't have enough heat or energy to remain in a vapor state. So as this gas is coming up, it is getting, your heat source is down here, right? So it's rising up away from the heat source. It's getting cooler, 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 and it can't make it. It contracts and condenses back into a liquid and falls back down. So within the column of a still, vapor is rising while alcoholic liquid that used to be a vapor has refluxed into liquid and is falling back down. And those two things passing each other are really important because those are a lot of your heavier, longer chain, low wines, alcohols, lower alcohols, kind of falling down through. And they have a lot of flavor as well as a lot of impurities you don't want. So this rising vapor is hopefully going to shear off those lighter flavor molecules that are attached to it while continuing to let these bad alcohols fall through and carry that flavor up and through. And that contact between the two of them, that sort of, if you were recycling your tails or bubbling spirit through your tails, like in a retort thumper doubler situation, you would be getting a lot of that similar effect. Those heavier alcohols coming in contact with the lighter alcohol vapor to create flavor. So hopefully that covered a little bit of contact plates and reflux so we can move forward a little bit. If I'm not being clear, guys, in the comments, be like, WTF, WTF, and I'll slow it back down. So yeah.